Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. I'm really glad you're joining us today. We're going to explore something truly fundamental to being human, our identities. This kind of invisible thread, weaves through everything we do, everything we are. How do we see ourselves? And maybe just as importantly, how do others see us? And what are the profound, often surprising, sometimes even, painful ways this whole dynamic impacts everything, from our deepest personal feelings right up to our largest societal interactions? This isn't just abstract theory. You see it play out every single day, even in the vibrant world inside a classroom. For this particular deep dive, we're digging into a really rich source. It's a detailed academic chapter, a real gold mine. It's called Identity, Immigration, and Prejudice in Europe, a recognition approach. You can find it in the big Handbook of Identity Theory and Research, and it was written by a brilliant team on Laura Licata, Margarita Sanchez-Mazas, and Eva G.T. Green. It's just an incredibly insightful piece for understanding this complex dance between who we are, where we belong, and, well, unfortunately, how prejudice so often crops up.
So our mission today, we want to unpack these complex ideas, identity and prejudice, and make them feel not just accessible, but really relevant to your world. We're especially thinking of you if maybe you're coming from an elementary education background, perhaps newly curious about psychology and identity and how these big concepts actually show up in everyday life, particularly with young learners. Think of this deep dive as like a shortcut to being well-informed. We'll pack it with surprising facts and hopefully just enough humor to keep you hooked on these fascinating psychological and sociological puzzles. So the big question we're circling around is this. How does this fundamental human need, this need for recognition, how does that shape who we are, how we treat others, and even how we build communities, whether that's a whole nation or maybe even the microcosm of a busy classroom?
That's such a vital question. It really gets to the heart of so much of our social experience because, as the source material points out right away, social identity is, well, it's a double-edged sword. It's this really powerful force. On one side, it's absolutely essential. It helps foster shared norms, shared values. It builds solidarity, that feeling of being connected, and it's basically a prerequisite for collective action, for people to actually get together and do things, build a school, advocate for change, whatever it is. But flip that sword over, and that strong connection to your own group, that in-group identification, it can often go hand in hand with prejudice and discrimination against others. It's the paradox, isn't it? The thing that binds us can also drive us apart, sometimes with shocking speed. What's fascinating, and the source really digs into this, is how modern societies are kind of wrestling with these contradictions. You see these huge efforts towards inclusion, tolerance, anti-discrimination laws popping up across Europe, for example. Yet, despite all these legal frameworks, we still see widespread racist and xenophobic attitudes. And these attitudes shape everything, from individual behavior right up to institutional policies. The source emphasizes that the origins of these attitudes, they're not static. It's not just one-sided. It comes from this dynamic process of mutual influence between groups, a constant back and forth, a push and pull that shapes how identities are formed and, importantly, perceived.
That double-edged sword idea really hits home. It makes you wonder, how does something so vital for community turn into a source of such division? What's the psychological mechanism, and where does this idea of recognition fit into all that?
Yeah, that's a perfect lead-in. Because to really get this, we need to unpack recognition itself. Imagine your identity isn't like some fixed block of marble, right? Imagine it's more like clay, constantly being shaped and reshaped by how others see you, how they interact with you, and crucially, whether or not they genuinely recognize you. This idea is absolutely central, and it brings us to the work of the German philosopher Axel Honneth. His 1996 theory, The Struggle for Recognition. Honneth's theory, especially when applied to things like racism and xenophobia, gives us this really powerful interactionist view. The core idea: humans are fundamentally relational animals. We don't just develop our sense of self in a vacuum. Our integrity, our identity, it's profoundly shaped by the recognition we get from others, especially from those we see as similar or significant in our lives. And this isn't just about, feeling good or getting a compliment. It's deeper. It's about a fundamental validation of our existence, our worth, our legitimate place in the world. And when recognition is denied, that's not just a slight, it's a profound form of exclusion, a direct challenge to someone's core sense of self and dignity. And what's really interesting is how this reframes prejudice. It stops being just a bad thought someone has or a dislike based on ignorance. Instead, it becomes an active denial of someone's fundamental right to be seen, valued, included as a full member of society. It's not just a feeling, it's a struggle over who gets to define what's normal, what's valued, who decides who belongs. Think of it less like a passive feeling and more like actively withholding something vital.
Wow, that's a really powerful shift. Prejudice isn't just attitude, it's about dignity. So if recognition is so crucial and denying it is so damaging, how does it actually play out? You mentioned Hanath broke it down.
Exactly. He identified 3 distinct spheres, almost like different arenas where the struggle for recognition happens. Each sphere contributes to building our identity, both personal and social, and denial in any of them can lead to conflict, to feelings of injustice. Let's start with the most intimate one, the private sphere. This is where recognition comes through love and friendship.
Okay, so family, close friends, romantic partners, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Those really strong, effective links with a pretty limited number of people. In this sphere, recognition isn't about status or what you achieve. It's about being seen and loved for who you are, just because you exist and you're connected to these specific people. The source explains this is where we cultivate our most basic self-confidence and self-trust. It shows us we're inherently worthy of affection, worthy of connection, that we're safe, cared for.
And thinking about that elementary classroom context again, how would that look?
Oh, it's crucial there. Imagine a child, let's call her Maya. She's quiet, maybe struggles a bit to connect. In the private sphere, recognition could be the warmth she feels from one close friend who really gets her love of drawing dinosaurs, Yeah. Or it could be from a supportive teacher, maybe Ms. Evans, who offers that unconditional, positive regard. Ms. Evans might notice Maya's talent and specifically praise her drawings, not just the neatness, but the creativity. Or she might carefully pair Maya with a kind classmate for group work, ensuring she feels included. When Maya feels genuinely cared for and connected like that, her basic self-confidence just, it blossoms.
Right.
So a great teacher isn't just managing behavior. They're actively fostering these positive peer relationships. They model empathy. They create an emotionally safe space. That helps build that private sphere recognition for all students. It's foundational.
Yeah, you can see how vital that foundation is. But we don't just live in our private bubbles, do we? We step out into the bigger world. How does recognition work there, in a world of laws and rules? That's the legal sphere, right?
It is, the legal sphere. In democratic societies, this is where individuals are granted equal rights and also have moral obligations. It's about fair treatment under the law, having your fundamental rights affirmed. When you're granted these rights, education, safety, property, voting, it's a signal. Society, the state, recognizes you as a morally responsible person, someone capable, deserving of protection. This sphere is absolutely crucial for self-respect, for dignity. It confirms your standing as an equal citizen. And denial here, well, that means legal exclusion, deprivation of basic rights.
Does the source give examples of that legal denial?
It does, unfortunately, very current ones from Europe. The ongoing struggle of undocumented immigrants. They often fight for rights many of us take for granted. Legal status, decent housing, legal work, sending kids to school without fear. The text mentions a specific case. 200 undocumented immigrants occupying a sports hall in Brussels, basically demanding the removal of these barriers. And even for legal immigrants, there's often the denial of political rights like voting unless they navigate the whole naturalization process. That's a clear denial of recognition in the legal sphere. They're not seen as full equal members.
And in the classroom, how does that legal sphere translate?
You see it in how rules and expectations are applied, or sometimes how they're not applied equally. Every child should have the right to speak in turn, access materials, participate fully, right, regardless of background, language, academic level. Denial might look like a teacher consistently overlooking a particular student for questions, maybe due to unconscious bias. Or maybe there are unwritten rules in the class dynamic that subtly exclude certain kids from a group project. It's denying their equal right to participate, undermining their self-respect as a student.
That difference between formal rights and informal exclusion is so key. Which leads us perfectly to the third sphere. This feels incredibly relevant today. The sphere of social esteem. This isn't about laws or private love, but about societal value.
Exactly. Social esteem. In the sphere, people judge each other based on the values, practices, cultural identities that are well appreciated in that society or group. You're valued positively if you have qualities or abilities that contribute to what the group values, or if your cultural identity is seen as respected, maybe even enriching. This sphere fosters self-esteem, a sense of worth based on your unique contributions, your respected differences. It lets you feel pride in who you are. Denial here. That looks like negative stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, informal rejection, even if you have all the legal rights on paper. It's about being seen as culturally incompatible, maybe, or just lacking social value in the eyes of the majority.
That sounds much harder to pin down than legal rights.
It is. And the source gives powerful examples. Even naturalized immigrants with full legal rights can face this informal rejection, maybe because of their appearance, their dress style. They suffer from pervasive negative stereotypes. The ban on Muslim headscarves in schools in some European countries is mentioned as a specific example. A deeply held practice is deemed unacceptable by the majority, effectively denying social esteem and cultural recognition. And think historically, like the Jim Crow laws in the U.S. After formal legal rights were granted post-Civil War, the denial just shifted. It moved squarely into social esteem, maintaining segregation and discrimination informally through social norms, microaggressions, biases. Being Black, despite legal freedom, was still equated with social inferiority.
So how does this social esteem dynamic play out in a classroom, beyond just academic grades?
It's huge. It's about recognizing diverse talents and contributions. Imagine a classroom that genuinely celebrates a child's artistic talent, or values their unique cultural stories, or applauds their kindness, their problem-solving skills, even if they aren't top of the class in reading.
Yeah.
That's fostering social esteem. Denial, though, might be subtle. A teacher or peers dismissing a child's cultural practices. Maybe comment like, "Why do you eat that?" instead of, "That looks interesting, tell me about it." Or only praising kids who fit a narrow definition of good student. A child who feels their culture or unique talents are subtly dismissed. They struggle with social esteem. They might feel they need to hide parts of themselves just to fit in.
It's like you can have the right to be in the room legally, but still feel completely invisible or devalued.
Precisely. And that summarizes Honneth's critical insight. In modern societies, legal rights are often formally affirmed, but the denial of recognition frequently shifts to the sphere of social esteem. It makes it incredibly tricky to fight because it's informal, subtle, embedded in social judgments. It operates below the radar of laws. This is why Honneth calls contemporary society the contempt society, where minorities constantly battle denials of their dignity, their contributions, their cultural identities. It's the stark opposite of the ideal decent society where everyone is valued.
The contempt society, that's a sobering phrase. It really makes you pause and think about the subtle ways we might deny recognition without even realizing it. So if recognition is this fundamental human need, why do majority groups deny it? What drives this contempt? What are the roots of prejudice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Social psychology has explored this from many angles. The source we're using breaks it down into two main branches of theory explaining prejudice from the majority view. First up, structural approaches. These theories tend to locate the causes of prejudice in the practical, tangible stuff. The dynamics of intergroup relationships, economic inequalities, power imbalances, direct competition over resources. They see prejudice as a kind of rational, though often misguided, response to perceived threats to a group's well-being.
Okay, so like competition for jobs or housing.
Exactly. That brings us to the first structural theory, realistic conflict theory. Sheriff proposed this back in '67. The core idea is pretty straightforward. Prejudice and conflict spark up when there's actual competition between groups over limited, tangible resources. Jobs, housing, money, political power stuff you can point to. It's often seen as a zero-sum game. One group's gain is automatically the other's loss. This helps explain why anti-immigrant feelings often spike during economic downturns, even if immigrants aren't objectively taking jobs. It's the perception of a threat to material interests that fuels it. The source notes this directly anti-immigration views, driven by the idea that immigrants threaten access to housing or jobs.
You can definitely see that dynamic in a classroom, can't you? Limited resources.
Oh, absolutely. Think about limited resources or desirable items. Only one cool swing on the playground, not enough popular art supplies. Kids will compete, and that competition can quickly turn into conflict and negative feelings, like two groups want the same set of Legos. One group starts hoarding them. These are ours, you can't have them. That creates conflict, negative feelings toward the other group who feels denied. The threat is to their play, their access, leading to prejudice against the other kids who want what they have.
Right, so that's direct competition. What else falls under these structural approaches?
Next is relative deprivation theory, building on work by Pettigrew and others. The key idea here is a subtle but crucial shift. Prejudice isn't just about objective lack of resources. It's more about the subjective feeling that your own group is disadvantaged or deprived compared to another group, which you perceive as having more. Perception is key. So even if a majority group isn't actually worse off objectively, if they feel they're losing out to immigrants, that subjective feeling of deprivation is enough to fuel prejudice. The source says it's about perceiving your in-group as disadvantaged compared to out-groups, like immigrants taking something that should be yours.
So it's about how you feel things are, and not necessarily how they are.
Exactly. In a classroom, think of a child feeling deprived because another kid gets praised more often, even if both are doing well. That subjective feeling of being overlooked, despite objective success, can breed resentment. Like if a teacher constantly praises one table for neat handwriting, other tables might feel unfairly disadvantaged, even if their work is also good. They perceive a disparity in recognition, leading to negative feelings towards the favored group.
Okay, realistic conflict, relative deprivation. What's the third structural theory?
The third one is social dominance theory, from Sedanius and Prado in 1999. This theory starts with the fundamental assumption. Societies naturally form group-based hierarchies. Dominant groups versus subordinate groups. Prejudice, in this view, is a powerful tool used by dominant groups to maintain their power and legitimize the existing inequality. It's systemic. And here's the kicker. Sometimes even subordinate groups buy into it, justifying the system that disadvantages them. That's called system justification. So this theory shows how prejudice gets baked into institutions, into ideologies. It's about maintaining social control. The source mentions dominant groups supporting ideologies that preserve their power, and this system justification idea can explain why even disadvantaged national groups might react negatively to immigrants, seeing them as competition from below.
How might that look in a classroom social structure?
Think about those established social hierarchies, often unspoken. The popular kids may be subtly excluding others from games to maintain their status. They might create unwritten rules that benefit them, like only kids who went to Sarah's party can play this. And the system justification part. Sometimes kids who are less popular might defend these dynamics. They internalize it. Well, they're popular because they're cooler, or that's just how it is. It maintains the pecking order without much challenge from the bottom.
Okay, so structural issues, competition, deprivation, power hierarchies are clearly a big part of the puzzle. But it feels like something's missing. There's an emotional, symbolic side to identity, isn't there?
You're spot on. That brings us to the second major approach, social identity theory, developed by Tajfel and Turner in 1986. This shifts the focus away from just material stuff towards our deep psychological need for a positive self-concept, which is tied inextricably to our group memberships. The core idea. Our self-concept isn't just about me, my personal identity, my unique traits. It's also about us. My social identity, the groups I belong to, family, school, nation, sports team, you name it. And we are fundamentally motivated to achieve a clear and, crucially, a positive social identity. We naturally categorize ourselves and others into in-groups and out-groups them. To feel good about our group, and therefore ourselves, we often compare our in-group to out-groups in a way that makes us look better. That's called achieving positive distinctiveness.
So putting down the other group makes us feel better about our own.
Sometimes, yes. Derogating an out-group is one strategy, but it's not automatic. It depends on things like how strongly you identify with your group, how important that identity feels right now. And this is key, whether you perceive your group's identity as being threatened by the out-group. The source explains that prejudice against immigrants often flares up when majority group members feel their national identity or even a regional identity, like being Flemish in Belgium, or a bigger one like European, is symbolically threatened. This isn't about jobs anymore. It's about feeling that immigrants' different values, cultural habits, religious practices, or political claims are somehow undermining who we are, our way of life, our collective self. It's a feeling that they're challenging us just by being different.
And in the classroom again? Team versus team.
Perfect example. Kids form teams for a game. The Super Spellers versus the Word Wizards. They quickly identify with our team. To get that positive distinctiveness, they might say, we're way faster, or we're smarter. Mild out group derogation, right? Now, expand that. A new student arrives, maybe from another country. They show the class a different way to solve a math problem, a method common back home. Some kids might feel their familiar way, how we do math, is threatened. This can lead to resistance, maybe negative feelings towards the new method, not because it's worse, but because it challenges the group's comfortable identity.
So social identity theory really connects with Honneth's recognition idea, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They're highly compatible, like two sides of the same coin. Social identity theory gives us the psychological engine why recognition matters so much, tied to our need for positive identity. And Honneth gives us the broader societal framework where and how these identity dynamics play out in terms of love, law, and esteem, and how denying recognition fuels conflict. They really enrich each other.
So it's not really structural or identity theories, but often both working together, like those realistic and symbolic threats you mentioned. And I loved that phrase from the source, redistribution is recognition. Can you unpack that a bit more? Sounds important.
It is important, and it comes straight from Honneth. Redistribution is recognition. It's this profound insight that material resources and identity are deeply intertwined. It means an unequal distribution of stuff, wealth, jobs, housing, good schools isn't just unfair materially. It carries a powerful symbolic message. When one group systematically has less, it implicitly says they are less valued, less worthy in society's eyes. It's a symbolic denial of recognition by dominant groups. So fighting for economic justice is fundamentally also fighting for identity and respect. Denying resources is, in a very real way, denying dignity.
That really connects the dots.
Yeah.
Which brings us squarely to how these theories play out in the real world, in concrete policies that grant or withhold recognition. Let's start with the big picture. Immigration policies in Europe, defining who's in and who's out.
Exactly. Immigration policies are a huge institutional way recognition is granted or denied. Ties right into Honnet's legal sphere. The source talks about Fortress Europe. Basically, after the 1970s oil crisis, most European countries really tightened up traditional work-related immigration. Legal paths got restricted mainly to family reunion, asylum seekers, or very specific high-skill work permits. And the EU itself, while creating amazing mobility within Europe for EU citizens, Italian moves to Belgium easily simultaneously built up this fortress against non-EU nationals. Opening internal borders meant strengthening external ones. This is a clear legal denial of recognition for those outside the EU club. The source calls it double exclusion, shut out from both national citizenship and this emerging European citizenship. It creates immense precarity, a feeling of belonging nowhere.
And how do people, the citizens, support these kinds of policies? You mentioned it shifts toward social esteem.
Right. The source makes a distinction between two types of criteria people might support for immigration: ascribed criteria and acquired criteria. Ascribed criteria are about inherent stuff, ethnic origin, national origin, maybe religion. Supporting policies based on these is explicitly xenophobic. It's saying exclude people based purely on who they are, a fundamental denial of worth. Acquired criteria seem fairer. They're based on things an individual can potentially control: education, skills, willingness to adopt the host country's way of life, learn the language.
But you said these can also be prejudiced.
They can, if they implicitly or explicitly demand immigrants abandon their own cultural heritage to be accepted. It sets up this one-sided expectation. You can come, but only if you become like us. So both types of criteria, ascribed or acquired, often end up being a denial of recognition. They basically say the in-group's values are the only valid ones, boosting the in-group by devaluing the out-group. Support for restrictive policies often gets framed as protecting national unity from a symbolic threat. Immigrants' different values seen as dangerous. It asserts the majority's values as the only benchmark.
Can you give a classroom parallel for that? Ascribed versus acquired criteria for joining a group.
Sure. Imagine a playground group saying, only kids who live on this street can play. That's ascribed, unchangeable. Or maybe, you can play if you know all the rules to our game and promise not to suggest new ones. That's acquired. Even that seemingly fair acquired rule becomes prejudiced if it demands the new child completely suppress their own ideas or background to conform. It denies their full self, asking them to erase parts of themselves to belong. You can join only if you stop being you.
Okay, so that's about getting in. What about policies for people already settled? Integration policies.
Right, integration policies. Historically, Europe had different models. The British model was more multicultural, viewing immigrants as ethnic groups, generally allowing cultural maintenance. The French model was more assimilationist, expecting immigrants to adopt French culture, integrate as individuals into a secular national identity. The German model was often seen as segregationist, historically defining the nation ethnically, excluding minorities from Germanness even if they lived there for generations.
But the source says things are changing, converging.
Yeah, there's a significant trend towards convergence. Many countries, even formerly multicultural ones like the Netherlands, are introducing compulsory citizenship trajectories, mandatory language courses, cultural norms lessons, civics tests. The Netherlands requiring a citizenship test in the country of origin for family reunion is a prime example. It signals a strong move towards assimilationist expectations. The burden is on the immigrant to change. And the source notes this backlash against multiculturalism, especially post 9/11 and other events, often specifically targets Muslim immigrants, framing them not just as culturally different, but as security or social threats, making the denial of recognition even harsher.
How would a teacher's approach reflect these models in the classroom?
It's a great parallel. A multicultural classroom might actively celebrate various holidays, encourage kids to share their heritage with pride, maybe a culture day, reverse books. An assimilationist approach might expect everyone to participate only in activities aligned with the dominant culture, maybe only American holidays, without acknowledging diverse backgrounds. This subtly denies recognition to other cultures, saying, your culture is for home, here we do things this way. The child gets the message their full identity isn't welcome.
So policies are powerful tools. But what about our own sense of belonging, our national identity, maybe even European identity?
Yeah.
Does being proud of your country automatically make you lean towards prejudice? That comes up a lot today.
It's a crucial point, and the source is very clear. Strongly identifying with your nation does not automatically lead to prejudice. The absolute key factor is how that nation is defined. Is it ethnic or is it civic?
Okay, break that down. Ethnic versus civic national identity.
An ethnic national identity defines the nation by shared ancestry, language, culture, often implying a common bloodline or origin. If this is the main view, immigrants who don't share these traits are often seen as threats, outsiders who can't truly belong. This strongly predicts prejudice. It's us versus them based on unchangeable things. A civic national identity, however, defines the nation by shared citizenship, common institutions, political allegiance to democratic values, not shared heritage. This is way less likely to lead to prejudice because it can embrace diversity within a shared legal and political framework. It's about shared principles, not shared blood. Research cited shows national ID predicted prejudice most strongly, where speaking the language was seen as more important than citizenship for belonging. That highlights the ethnic definition at work. The shift in the Netherlands from multiculturalism towards assimilation coincided with more negative views of immigrants, especially Muslims, precisely because national identity was framed more ethnically.
How does a school define its community? Is that a similar idea?
Exactly similar. If a school emphasizes only its long-standing traditions, specific historical events, maybe only celebrates dominant cultural activities, an ethnic definition of the school community, new kids or those from different backgrounds can feel excluded. I don't know the school song, I wasn't here for Founders Day, I don't belong. But if the school emphasizes shared values, learning, respect, kindness, participation from everyone, regardless of background, a civic definition, it creates a much more inclusive space where everyone feels valued.
And what about the European level? Does identifying as European also play into this?
It adds another layer. EU citizenship gave rights to EU nationals, but as we said, doubly excluded non-EU nationals. This raised the possibility. Could a superordinate European identity also lead to xenophobia, but aimed outwards at non-Europeans? A new us versus them on a continental scale. And again, how European identity is conceived matters hugely. If it's seen as a single shared culture, history, maybe Judeo-Christian values, and ethnic conception, it correlates with rejecting non-EU foreigners. But if it's more civic, a shared political project, democracy, human rights, it's linked to more favorable attitudes. A Belgian study found European ID could predict higher xenophobia towards non-EU immigrants, paradoxically, even when people associated Europe with tolerance. This happens if the European project is seen as replacing national identities with one single cultural European one, rather than coexisting with national identities, European and German, not European instead of German.
So even at the school district level, if you try to force one uniform school identity and erase classroom differences,
you risk creating that us versus them. Students who don't fit the mold feel alienated. But if the school celebrates both the overarching school identity and the unique identities of different classrooms or student groups, maybe through showcases, diverse books, valuing different learning styles, you foster better intergroup relations, everyone feels they belong somewhere within the larger whole.
such a crucial distinction between ethnic and civic belonging. It really shows how our definitions of us shape how we see them. Okay, we've talked a lot about the majority view, the policies denying recognition. What about the other side? How do minorities react? What does it feel like to be on the receiving end of prejudice? And how do people respond?
Yeah, shifting perspective is vital. Experiencing denial of recognition has a profound emotional and psychological toll. Recognition isn't just nice to have, it's fundamental for positive self-regard. Discrimination, legal or informal, isn't just about restricting freedom or resources. It deeply wounds expectations of equality and respect. It leads to feelings of injustice, anger, sadness, often diminished self-worth. This sense of injustice can motivate a response, but it's not automatic, and people react differently.
So why do people sometimes organize collectively and sometimes not?
Collective action group-based mobilization is much more likely when the denial is seen as group-specific, meaning this is happening to us because we are Group X, not just I had bad luck. Overt, obvious discrimination is also more likely to trigger action than subtle prejudice because it makes the injustice undeniable, clearly targeting the group. This helps explain why some people might internalize prejudice, blaming themselves, while others rally together for systemic change. Recognizing systemic injustice is key. The source stresses that collective deprivation feeling your group is disadvantaged predicts collective action much better than just personal deprivation.
Okay, so what kinds of responses do minority groups typically have when faced with inequality or feeling their identity isn't valued?
Social identity theory highlights two main strategies: individual mobility versus social change. Individual mobility is the preferred route if group boundaries seem permeable. If you believe you can personally cross into the dominant group and improve your status within the existing system. The system itself seems stable, legitimate, so the goal is personal improvement. Work harder, assimilate, try to pass. Social change becomes the strategy if boundaries feel solid, you can't escape your group status no matter what you do, and the system seems unstable or illegitimate. Here, the goal is to improve the whole group's position, often through collective action, protests, demanding reform.
Is there an example of that shift?
Yes, the source uses the powerful example of Congolese decolonization. Initially, leaders like Lumumba pushed for individual mobility, seeking privileges for Europeanized Congolese. But when this elite realized they were still seen as blacks, denied status, subject to racism, they shifted strategy. They mobilized for independence for all Congolese. Social change became the goal because individual mobility failed against rigid group boundaries.
And in a classroom, a kid feeling excluded.
Exactly. A child excluded from a playgroup. If they see the group as permeable, they might try individual mobility, practice the game harder to get invited. They believe they can cross the boundary. But if they realize the rules are fundamentally unfair to everyone not in kids, maybe rules always change to favor the in kids and individual effort won't work, they might shift to social change. Advocate for fairer rules for everyone, talk to the teacher, maybe even start a new, more inclusive group, challenging the old order.
Are there other models for responses?
Yes, building on this is Albert Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty model. Faced with an unsatisfactory situation, minorities can use their voice proactively claim injustice, speak up, protest, organize. Or they can choose exit, retreat, withdraw emotionally or physically, disengage. Or third, show loyalty, submit to authority, accept the status quo, maybe hope things improve or feel powerless to change them. The choice depends on perceptions, resources, the nature of the denial.
So the unfairly treated child in class
Could use their voice, tell the teacher, confront peers. Could exit, play alone. Or could show loyalty, go along with it to avoid conflict.
And how do people cope psychologically with being stigmatized?
It's complex. Sometimes, under pressure, people might inadvertently confirm negative stereotypes. That's stereotype threat. Like African American students performing worse on tests when the intellectual incompetence stereotype is subtly activated. The anxiety itself hurts performance. But people also protect their self-esteem through external attributions, attributing bad experiences to discrimination. I didn't get the job because they're biased, rather than personal failing. I wasn't good enough. This buffers self-esteem. And really powerfully, there's the rejection identification model. Schmidt and Branscombe found that being targeted by discrimination can actually lead to increased identification with your disadvantaged group. Surprisingly, this stronger group ID can improve well-being by buffering discrimination's negative effects. You find strength, solidarity, worth within the group that understands. The source notes Turkish immigrants in the Netherlands perceiving rejection showed increased ethnic religious ID but decreased Dutch national ID. They leaned into their group for support.
Which leads to different kinds of identification, right? Separatist versus dual.
Exactly. Separatist identification is identifying exclusively with the minority group. This often leads to ethnocultural claims focused only on the group, potentially non-normative action, maybe even violence, if mainstream channels offer zero recognition. Dual identification is simultaneous identification with both the minority group and the receiving nation. This is hugely beneficial. It facilitates normal political participation, integration, navigating both worlds. German Turks with dual ID showed higher normative political participation. Separatist ID correlated more with radical groups, though importantly not necessarily violence.
And our new student from another country.
If they feel constantly unrecognized, dismissed, they might only hang out with kids from similar backgrounds, separatist ID, finding recognition there. But if the teacher fosters an environment where their original culture and their identity as student in this class are both valued, they're more likely to develop dual identification, feeling comfortable in both worlds, contributing fully.
That's such a helpful framework. It shows minorities aren't just passive victims, they're actively responding, shaping their identity and society. So, what's the way forward? How do we actually build societies and classrooms of mutual recognition?
Well, the hopeful part is that social change is possible. The source argues it's often triggered by struggles for recognition when people's expectations of fairness aren't met. Minorities are agents of change. By expressing their claims publicly, using their voice, they can influence majority norms, push society towards greater recognition of diversity. It's not always smooth, can be conflictual, but it's how progress often happens. Kimlicka noted that liberal multiculturalism in Western Europe didn't just spring from majority goodwill, it came from minorities actively demanding recognition publicly. Even undocumented immigrants asserting their presence, like in Brussels, can strengthen democracy by forcing a rethink of who belongs.
So giving people a voice is key, fostering dialogue.
Absolutely crucial. Granting voice and fostering dialogue. Having some shared principles, fairness, dignity is a starting point. But then you need a genuine space for communication, for mutual influence between groups. When minorities are fully recognized as legitimate participants in public debates, it breaks down stereotypes. You see the diversity within the group, not just a monolith. This heterogeneity combats prejudice. Conversely, denying public space recognition, silencing voices, that often fuels separatist identities, potentially leading to violence as the only perceived way to be heard.
How do we do that in a classroom? Encourage that dialogue, that mutual recognition daily.
It's about creating that culture where every voice genuinely matters, every child feels seen, heard. Granting recognition doesn't mean blindly accepting every single claim or abandoning all norms. It means initiating a process of mutual influence, treating immigrants or any minority group in class as a valuable party. Their perspectives matter. Engaging in real debate and dialogue with them, not ignoring or dismissing their concerns as irrelevant or disruptive. And the cost of not doing this is high. If societies fail to respond positively to recognition claims, minorities will likely seek it elsewhere, maybe isolating within their own communities or looking back to countries of origin. This seriously blocks the path to truly multicultural, peaceful, decent societies where everyone feels they belong. Historically, you see a pattern. Get legal recognition, then demand social esteem, then demand full participation in public debates. Undocumented immigrants fight for basic rights. Legal immigrants then fight for social esteem, access. It's an ongoing struggle for deeper recognition. The source mentions Mexican immigrants in the U.S. facing both legal denials, like lack of required bilingual ed, and social denials, seen as a material threat. The journey is rarely simple or finished.
This has been incredibly illuminating. Thinking about identity being constantly molded by recognition or its denial, it really shifts your perspective, doesn't it? The idea that prejudice isn't just a negative thought, but an active denial of someone's fundamental right to be seen, valued, that's profound. It's not just what you think, it's what you do or don't do to affirm dignity. We saw how structural things like resource competition and power dynamics mix with social identity needs like wanting our group to feel positive, to fuel prejudice, and how policies, immigration, integration are these incredibly powerful tools for granting or withholding recognition, shaping how we all coexist. But we also saw the resilience, the agency of minorities, how their struggles for recognition can drive positive change, especially when they're given a real voice, a space for dialogue. So as you go about your day, especially if you work with young people, maybe consider this thought. How might really focusing on creating a culture of recognition, where every single person's unique contributions, their background, their identity are not just tolerated, but genuinely valued, celebrated, given a voice, how might that transform our daily interactions? From the smallest classroom to the biggest global community, what small act of recognition could you offer today? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into identity, immigration, and that profound human need for recognition. We really hope this exploration has given you some new insights and encourage you to keep reflecting. Until next time, keep diving deep.